Hi, everybody. I'm Eliza Anyangwe, the very late moderator for the session. Thank you for hanging around. You're attending the session called The Rebirth of Local Journalism with a question mark, and we didn't do that to just be a little bit mysterious. There is very much a sense that local investigative reporting is having a sort of new wind, and we wanted to pull together people with very different perspectives from lots of different geographies, because I don't know if you've noticed, there tends to be a focus on these conversations in Perugia around really US, UK models. But what does it look like from a Central European perspective? What does it look like from a Middle Eastern perspective? What does it look like from Scotland? We always forget they're there too. So yay, the Scots in the house, winning the Scot vote. And so we would like to sort of consider a few questions together. We only have an hour, and so the hope is to be very streamlined with how we discuss this, looking at what is it that is sort of behind this rebirth from the various perspectives that we have here on stage. What do we need to do to sustain this? And be very clear that we're talking about local investigative reporting with the specific conditions that make for investigative reporting, and to distinguish it from just local journalism altogether. So I will be moderating, but joining in the conversation briefly to wear my hat as community organizer at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism on our local reporting investigative team called the Bureau Local. And joining me on stage, from my left to my furthest left, I guess. My immediate left is Rachel Hamada, who was one of the co-founders and is a director at the Ferret in Scotland. Next to her is Andras, Petho, who is the co-founder and editor of Direct 36 in Hungary. And last but not least, she's not appearing in your program because Inga couldn't join us. She's joining us as a very generous replacement with lots of information. Is Majdoleen, who is talking from a Jordanian perspective. Is that right? Yes, okay, phew. right panel. So please do welcome them all. They'll introduce themselves to you also in a bit. But yes, clap. Yes. Cool. So in terms of format, I'm just going to put the same question to each of our panelists. It will give them an opportunity to set out their stall, really, and tell you a bit more about their work. And that question, guys, is what does the rebirth, this rebirth we're talking about, what does it look like from where you are and where you work? Do you want to start us off, Rachel?
Sure. I'm going to keep this part fairly brief because we've got a lot of meat to kind of get into later, so I'll be quick. But just for a little bit of background, in Scotland, like everywhere else, the newspaper industry has been going through troubled times. There have been lots of cuts to reporting, especially investigative budgets, because investigations take time. They can be resource intensive. So myself and a bunch of 4 other journalists decided to set up a member-owned cooperative that would look at investigative journalism stories on behalf of kind of citizens in Scotland. So the way we're structured, our readers are our owners, they're also on our board. They help us shape big strategic decisions about our future. We publish stories on subjects such as environment, human rights, extremism in the far right, surveillance, politics, and much, much more. We also have a fact-checking service, so we fact-check claims made by politicians, the media, and so on. What we're really fundamentally trying to do is to prove the viability of a financially sustainable public interest media model, specifically in Scotland, but there may then be kind of useful kind of crossover learnings for other places. So far, we're about 3 years old. We've had massive support from Scottish civic society, tons of interest. We continue to investigate politicians, companies, public bodies, anyone who's kind of a power holder, regardless of who they are. We're very non-partisan, fully independent. Our tagline, we kind of went for a slightly humorous name, just to kind of be memorable in the public eye. And our tagline is nosing up the trousers of power. So the idea is that looking into power is like a collective endeavor, and that we undertake this endeavor on the public's behalf with them. We share skills and training with Scottish Civic Society to allow them to interrogate power better. And we also train people to be journalists, so we're filling a bit of the gap that has been left by the newspaper industry in that regard, as far few people are coming up through the ranks and receiving full training. I've got a few other points, but I think I might come to them later because I'm conscious of not wanting to hog the mic for too long.
Thank you. Andras?
Is this on? Yeah, I think
Yep.
so. Yeah, so yeah, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but first I would like to talk about the death of local reporting, at least in Hungary. I mean, my country has been receiving quite a lot of attention because of primarily because of the media situation. As you know, as you may know, that the government and the forces close to the government, its allies, have taken over a big part of the Hungarian media, and this is especially true for the local outlets. Basically, the independent media has been wiped out in the countryside, which I mean, places outside Budapest. And there are a few outlets surviving, but I know that they are struggling financially. They are also they told me that the more they are embedded in the community, and the bigger the danger and the risk is for them. As one reporter explained it to me, that if she writes about the local powerful people, then she has family members working as police officers, teachers in the local municipality, and they will suffer the consequences. So, but there are some initiatives, mostly coming from Budapest-based outlets. Index, which is the largest news site, and it's independent. It's often very critical with the government. They just launched a new project in which they are trying to cover more local stories, and their reporters are spending more time outside Budapest, which I think this is a good project. Átlátszó, which is another investigative nonprofit in Hungary, they also launched a similar project. They try to hire freelancers and find local journalists who would uncover local wrongdoings and expose problems locally. And we also did. I mean, Direct 36 is not by definition. We don't define ourselves as a local outlet, but Hungary is so small that even if you do national stories, it's basically local. There are so few players, even when it comes to powerful people or powerful organizations. So whatever you do is both national and local at the same time. And just one example for this kind of local focus is that when we did a story about a member of parliament who is representing a rural area in south of Hungary, and then we exposed how he had hidden assets and hidden businesses outside Hungary. And then when we published this story, then my colleagues went to that area that he's representing, and then they handed out flyers and distributed print products so that the story reaches his constituents. We haven't heard from him yet. I don't know how happy he was with this initiative. So yeah,
we're going to definitely explore that more, the ways in which what we're talking about, this rebirth, actually also means the different ways in which people might be thinking about not just how to engage audiences, but how to disseminate their content, given that communities, what local looks like, might be changing. But before we do that, let's hear your perspective too on how you define the issues.
Yeah, actually I want to talk about, because now I'm working as an Arabic editor for Global Investigative Journalism Network. So I want to talk about the entire region, not just about Jordan. Actually, I'm sharing, the point of view of Andras, because we don't have actually rebirth of local investigative journalism, because it's just the possibility of having a good and quality and investigative local journalism is getting harder and harder. As you know, in my region, countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, are categorized as the most countries dragging their journalists to prisons, They spent millions of dollars to spying on reporters and journalists, tracking them and killing them. Everybody knows about Jamal Khashoggi and what happened to him. So, and actually, our independent news organizations and initiatives, find it very difficult to intercount these huge and massive resources that our governments pour just to fight them and silence them. But despite this dark reality, Arab journalists and local journalists in my region start to realize more their importance of just telling their own story by themselves. They are more knowledgeable than before. And we starting seeing new media startups, local news media startups working on investigative journalism stories in Tunisia, like Intifada, Mada Masr in Egypt, and Hibr from Jordan, Al-Jamhuriya in Syria, and also Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, ARIJ. They just support all local journalists in my region to do more investigative local reporting. The only thing that they need more support, they need to be more structured and more organized.
Okay. So that gives us a little sort of like overview, and it's a good thing that when we talked about the panel, we did include this question mark, because it's, if you're in London or you're in the States, you might think that there is this rebirth, there's lots of growth in new players, but what there's also is lots of pressure on journalists who are trying to do local investigative reporting in some more difficult contexts. So rather than just defining rebirth as more platforms, let's think about it as different ways of engaging. How are you doing your local journalism, your investigations differently? And one of these really new ways of doing it is thinking about community engagement in a way that was different to how it was done before. So as I said at the beginning, just to, not quite a disclaimer, but just by way of explanation, Rachel and I job share at the Bureau Local in this newfangled role, at least in terms of its name in journalism, called community organizers. And what that looks like is that we are trying to think about, well, if the knowledge of how an investigation can be done and the skills and resources to do that doesn't reside solely in the newsroom, how do you bring in other people to not just share your story at the end? We're not trying to just amplify our messages, but to get people to be involved in how we get the story, in how we develop the story, in how we disseminate the story, and what happens even after that. And what the Bureau Local, even before our time, has been very successful at doing is building a network across the UK where individuals, whether they be journalists or in civic tech or just members of the public or hyperlocal bloggers who feel similarly to us about the power and potential of local investigations, can then come alongside as we share our data and set up some ground rules for how we do that. That completely changes the role of the journalist, because we're not sort of ferreting away, your word, we're not just ferreted away sort of doing our own thing. We are actually also project managing a process that involves people who might not otherwise work to the same constraints that we do. So that is the experience of it at the Bureau Local. What does that sort of new approaches to working look like, whether it be at the Ferret or Direct 36 or in any of the local platforms Should we start with you, Andras?
Yes, when we launched Direct 36, my organization, about a little bit more than 4 years ago, then we started also a crowdfunding campaign. And at the time, to be honest, it was more like we knew that as we looked at other campaigns, we knew that we cannot just ask for money, we need to give something in return. And we didn't want to make t-shirts or mugs, and so we thought of what we can give is the insight into our work. So that's why we came up with these ideas that we give them, our supporters, exclusive newsletters, ebooks, and we organize events for them. But then, but it was still this kind of transactional, approach, even from our part. But then, as we started to organize, especially the live events, and or when it was not from the very beginning, but in our second year, we started to organize workshops for our most premium supporters, those who gave the most. And it was, we invited them into our office, and we had workshops. We shared our reporting methods, interviewing techniques, how we analyze data. And then inevitably these workshops evolved into conversations. So we also learned a lot from them. And we got story ideas. You just get to know these people, who they are. You get to know their background, and it turned out that interestingly, many of them had technological background. So many of them helped us with coding, programming, scraping big data sets and structuring them, which was really helpful because we don't know how to. We don't have coders on our staff, so this grew into something bigger, and now we tried to even formalize this. So when the new supporters join us, then we ask them to, we ask them if they would like to share their expertise with us. So we are building a database of the skills of our members. So we know that if we work quite a lot on Russian influence and the Hungarian-Russian, this special relationship. And so very often, and we don't speak Russian, so we need help with translations. And fortunately, it turns out that many of our supporters speak Russian and speak other languages that we don't speak. So now we can reach out to them, and they are really generous with their time and expertise. So,
can I ask you a follow-up question, which is, particularly in the sort of sensitive context of investigative reporting in Hungary, does that does that spread risk to your members when you involve them in this way it may be risk that they might not have been prepared to take on in the way that you expect to be challenged as investigative reporters?
Unfortunately, yes, this is one of our biggest challenges, and that we can see that the fear is spreading, and now I know some of our former supporters or long-time supporters come to us and say that, okay, so I wouldn't like to transfer money to you. Is there any other way I can? Because they are afraid that their bank accounts are being monitored, and it's really hard, because what can you tell them? I mean, I cannot give them guarantees. We always tell them that, of course, our membership data is the most valuable data that we have. So we really guard it very closely. But of course, I cannot give them guarantees, and so yes, it takes. A kind of courage from their side as well. Fortunately, Hungary, although the situation has been getting worse year by year, but it's still not Turkey, not Russia, not Saudi Arabia. So I think what I try to tell them is that I think there is still more room, and they shouldn't let be intimidated.
Majdoleen, maybe you want to build on that. You were nodding very seriously there, but also, what does community engagement look like from the perspective of the investigative newsrooms you are familiar with?
Yeah, actually, we don't have structured form for community engagement in the Middle East. But actually, our people are not stupid. They know that, who really want to serve them and help them. So I have two documented experiences. While I was just managing an investigative journalism unit, a local investigative journalism unit in Jordan, we did an investigation that revealed abuses against orphans, sexual and physical abuses against orphans. And public orphanages, and amazingly, our supporter are the orphans themselves who recently graduated from those care fosters. They generously gave us information, obtained documents, and support us even after the publication thing. Also, another experience, we also tracked the international fund that supposed to be just to establish development projects in the poor areas, in the poor provinces in my country. The employees, the municipal employees, just also gave us information, documents, and helped us to do this investigation. So the most important thing and key, just to let them trust you and let them feel that you are working just to support them. So there's a community sense, but so far not that much structured.
It's really interesting that you're talking about trust, because at the Bureau we've just concluded over a year of investigating homeless deaths in the UK, and what we found was our reporter needed to do a lot of work to build trust, not even necessarily with people with lived experience, as we call them, so homeless people are the support services that they work with, but even with other charities and in the sector, because the expectation of expectations about journalists is that we work in an extractive way. So an investigative journalist might be working on a topic over a longer period of time, but the relationship, the contract with the people they report about is still, I'll tell your story, I know best, I'll go away and do that. And actually what that did over time was erode the willingness for people to work with you and to tell you what's going on.
And I want to add something, after a few years of doing this work, people start, reaching us and telling us stories, kind of whistleblowers. You know that you are in this small unit with very, very limited and modest resources, are doing good work. So how about doing this story? I can give you the information. So this kind of community sense, but I think from my point of view, it needs more organized work.
Rachel, what does that look like from the Ferret? I mean, you've talked about there was an expressed interest in embedding community in the investigative reporting work of the Ferret. So has that been smooth sailing? What does that look like in practice?
I don't think any of this stuff is ever smooth sailing. It may occasionally look like it from the outside, but can assure you it never ever is. But to move on to a nice slick...
Something cheery.
I'm going to, geez. Yeah, to move on to a slicker phrase, I have a saying that we like to say, which is collaboration is the new competition. So the old media model is we're all up against each other, we're all fighting for the same stories, we're all fighting for a slice of the same advertising budget. Now, if anything, people are kind of reaping rewards through collaborating, whether with other media outlets, with kind of community groups, with their members, with their readers. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind. And even at the funding panel I was at earlier, they were saying that pitches to funders will be even more effective if you are collaborating with another media outlet. So I think that's quite an interesting kind of shift to note. In terms of the Ferret itself, I guess we had kind of three main goals that we were going for. One was financial sustainability so that we can keep on going. Another was the kind of quite broad one of kind of strengthening civil society and kind of public transparency. But the last one was definitely this sense of kind of collective endeavour that we were working together with our readers and the members of our community to make a change and to hold power to account. So there's a few different ways that we kind of put community at the heart of our model. One was that we asked initially the public, we now ask our membership about what topics they want us to investigate. So when we first started off, we asked people that, and they asked for investigation into fracking, which was then crowdfunded. We produced a package of about, 10 to 12 stories, fed that back to the people who had funded it in the first place. That also created quite a lot of impact. That work went into government policy reports and contributed to a fracking ban in Scotland. So there's quite a tangible impact as well for readers. As I mentioned before, we have a membership model. We're a cooperative, and that kind of sense of accountability and transparency is really important as part of community building. So if we're holding other people to account and expecting them to be transparent in their workings, then we also have to be too, so that we're not hypocrites. So that includes things like we publish a quarterly transparency report to our members to say where all our money came from and what all of it was spent on during that period. We also have something called the Ferret Underground, which is a way of building a community around our community. So we have the paying subscribers that come to our site. But we also have people who are interested in our work, maybe don't want to make the financial commitment yet, or are unsure, or are interested in some of our stories but can't necessarily afford access. So if people join that, they can access 10 stories a month as opposed to 3. They can join our Facebook community page where they can get engaged with the stories, feed into them, and so on. We have a newsletter that goes out to anyone who signs up, which includes links to lots of our stories, but also other good stories in the field. We have a poll every week, so we take into account people's kind of opinions on different subjects. We also have a text messaging system, so we have lots and lots of our membership are signed up to this, and we can ping them texts on lots of different subjects. It could be asking them what they want us to report next. It could be asking for their insight on a particular topic. It could be telling them about a story on a subject that they've expressed interest in. So that's been really, really useful. One other thing that we've been doing in terms of community engagement is a training program called Story Lab, which was funded in conjunction with the Centre for Investigative Journalism, who I see sitting in the audience. Bigging you up. So what we did for that was we recruited around 15 people who maybe hadn't had the opportunity to get into journalism through conventional means, or hadn't had the opportunity to study full time. And we took 3 months. This was effectively a story incubator. We took them from the very germ of a story idea through training on data journalism, FOIs, online research, storytelling, with the objective at the end that they could each publish a story. So not every story came to fruition, but there were some really, really strong stories out of it, looking at things like restraint of mental health patients being on the rise. There's a really good story on drug deaths in Dundee. So it was also really kind of helped to support local stories. Dundee, if you don't know it, is a Scottish city that actually has the highest rate of drug deaths in all of Europe, but it had been very little reported on. So we had someone who joined the course who had lived experience of that, knew that community well, had their trust, and she worked with them to tell that story rather than us parachuting in from outside. So that was a really successful program. Unfortunately, it's not been funded next year, so we're trying to work out if we can do that ourselves. But yeah.
I wanted to ask Andras and Majdoleen if you could respond to that, this long list of things that seem to be done in newsrooms that involve gauging people's opinion and what they would like to do from the, what do you think of that? I mean, because I feel like we have set up this sort of community engagement as the benchmark for how to do collaborative, investigative local journalism. Would these things be replicable from the context where you are? I think it's just worth recognizing that not everybody can tomorrow decide to poll their members or send out text messages to everybody. What does that look like? I'm curious as to your responses to all the things the Ferret is doing.
It's not something easy to replicate. Because, in some stories, if we mention the name of our members, they might be sued or attacked by our governments. Practically, we witnessed something similar in the orphan, that investigation, the orphans investigation. We worked actually with the community, the orphans community in Jordan, and actually after we published the story, we been threatened, I and my husband, who co-published the story with me, who was working as an investigative reporter, same like me, and we threatened just if we did not reveal their identities, we will be sued, and also they threatened, they pressured the newspaper which published the story to retract it, to cancel it. And we had very rough and harsh battle with the government, and we said no, we will not do that. And the next day we've been sued, and the retraction was issued. So we paid the price, but we were satisfied because we keep their identities not revealed, because we know if we give their names, their fate will be miserable, and we don't do that. We don't like to do that.
Andras, what do you think?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, probably you cannot replicate everything, but I think it's also a question of how you dedicate your resources. And so, I mean, I'm proud to announce. It's not. No. Sorry, no. It's not going to make international headlines, but it's a big step in the history of Direct 36 that just a few days ago we hired our first non-journalist to the team, whose job is going to be to help us engage better with our audience and with our members, and we want to know more about them, and we want to have more opportunities to to stay in touch with them and hear from them. So
money well spent, hopefully.
Yes, that's what we hope for. Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to add something briefly, because I witnessed that, personally when I start working with GIGN Arabic. We starting focusing on building community engagement programs in that new startups that I mentioned before. So during a regional conference, we did sustainability workshop for these news organizations, and we start working with them. Our focus now just to make this work systematic so we can replicate these kind of models successfully. Yeah. We hope so.
Well, often I find at these events that you're burning to ask a question and you're watching the clock tick down, and then at 10 minutes to the end they say, now time for questions. So we're going to try not to do that, because there's a wealth of experience and geographic viewpoints. So let's go earlier to you to take any questions. I have a ton. I've been preparing this for a couple of months, but do you have any that have been sparked by what you've heard? We can take a few together if there are any in the room. Don't let me down, guys. Come on now. Oh, there's one in the doorway. Oh, no. Okay. Oh, the mic is going round. Okay. Any questions at all? I'm curious, actually, also from the floor, because lots of journalists attend these events, why people are at the session on the rebirth of local investigative journalism, and maybe there are things that you would like to hear from the front of the room that you're not hearing yet. Yes, there are a couple of hands at the back. Can we start there, please? And then we'll take the second. No, with you.
Oh, right. Hi. I don't think it's on. Is it on?
Yes.
Hello. So I teach journalism at Birmingham City University, and hello from Marvin Cole, by the way. Marvin Duffy to you, Eliza. But loads of students, we see far more students now coming through wanting to be investigative journalists. I think this is a real change. I mean, I've been teaching for 20 years, and journalism students used to want to be reporters, but on kind of interesting, fun kind of stuff. We are seeing a rise in the number of students. So I think that's a really positive move, because clearly if there's a lot more investigative journalism, you'll need more journalists who work in that particular way. So I think it's a very positive move, actually.
Do they want to be local investigative journalists? Or
Some
do they
do,
want
actually,
to be,
and some come from that sphere, already doing hyperlocals and that kind of stuff already. So it's positive.
Yes, thank you for sharing. There's a question at the back there, or a comment.
Hi, I wanted to ask about how you finance your project particularly. Because all the stuff that you were saying sounded amazing, but I feel like each thing you said would have to have a full-time person on there.
Your mind was just churning through the figures?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, let's take a few, but the question of how do we finance this, I think, Andras, you touched to that, right? Like, how do we make this pay? Who has the mic? Yes, go for it.
Another question?
Yes.
So the idea of crowdsourcing ideas from the public, I think, is a really cool one, and very interesting also bringing people into your offices and talking about these things. There seems to be so many conspiracy theories going around, though, from the public right now, and I wonder how you handle when people are like, yes, we have something, we want you to look into chemtrails or vaccinations, and how it's a conspiracy. How do you deal with moderating what you can actually approach and what you are interested in doing?
Yeah, great question. Any more? Let's see if we can take 3. No, you want to judge first based on the answers to these? Okay, you're a tough crowd. But there's definitely something about our office being called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, where I think people think we're kind of like a 1940s style Dick Tracy, kind of like, can you investigate whether my husband's cheating on me type situation. But maybe if that paid, we should start a sort of a spin-off, a PI office. Okay, there are 2 questions here and the comment. Maybe somebody wants to speak to that, but Rachel, let's start with you.
Okay, that's really encouraging about the growth of students wanting to look at investigative journalism. That chimes with the training program that we run, that we had huge amounts of applications for, particularly from women. It was about 75% women who applied for those places, which was super interesting. What am I responding to? The money one? Money.
There's a specific question about crowdfunding, and
yes.
crowdfunded too, so you
yeah.
can talk about that, but how do you make it all add up?
Yeah, how do you make it add up? So we did use crowdfunding to launch, and it was a super effective tool because it allowed us to not only get money in for our first investigations, but also to build up a membership base and people who were really engaged already with what we were doing. Having got a few years in, generally that model has become less useful to us because people already know us, and we look at other revenue streams. Our main one is membership, so people pay the equivalent of about €4 a month to join. And that growth trajectory has been up and up and up and up and up. And that's recurring revenue, so that's money that we know is going to come in every month as reliable income. And having that kind of income as opposed to grant money, which starts and stops, is super useful. So I kind of recommend that as a tactic if it's one that you have the wherewithal to kind of adopt. But it's a slow, steady process. It's not necessarily fast. Got a couple of other income streams. We do have some project and grant funding, particularly for specific projects. And we also have media partnerships. So we work with big, more well-known mainstream media outlets, often to publish stories, which has the benefit that A, the money we get from them covers any editorial costs of the stories, but B, that we get a larger audience for what are often quite important public interest investigations. So those are probably some of our main things. We did some usual typical things like merch that was a bit meh, and I would say kind of subscriptions, rolling subscriptions, and keeping your members happy and engaged is probably one of the best methods you can use because it keeps you really properly sustainable.
First I would like to address the comment on the interest in investigative reporting, and it's of course it's great to hear, and I think please tell your students that I think that there is nothing more rewarding than the local investigative reporting. If you expose something in your own community, because then sometimes physically you can feel how it resonates. I was lucky enough to have spent some time at the investigative unit of the Washington Post, and under a fellowship program, and I remember when the editor Jeff Lean told me how when he was still at the Miami Herald and he was doing stories about drug trafficking, and then when he broke some big story, and then yes, it just resonated in the community. And sometimes when we are, it's easy to forget, but when we are talking about some of the big global projects, what makes them really powerful and strong is the local element. I was very lucky to be part of the Panama Papers, for example, and then I think what made Panama Papers so powerful and so impactful, because it had a huge global story, but all those 400 reporters brought the local angle. I was writing about these Hungarians who had hidden offshore accounts and offshore businesses, and that's why there was so much interest in that project in Hungary. If I had just written about the in general, global offshore businesses, whatever, nobody would have paid attention. So I think it's a very important thing to point out. And in terms of funding, I think we are it's a similar model. We have a mixed revenue structure. We've got grants from foundations, international foundations. We also have some business revenues, not from investigating divorces or cheating husbands. Sometimes we get approached, not exactly with offers like this, but from apparently this financial business intelligence industry is booming, and so sometimes they approach us, but it's a very dangerous territory. So we so far we always said no, but we make some money from doing research for other news organizations, for a bigger TV station. We did research in Hungary, and now that Hungary is, is getting so much scrutiny and so much attention, it means that a lot of foreign journalists are coming Hungary, and we are exploiting that, and well, not really exploiting, but we are offering our services to them, and if we spend a few days with them, it's a lot of work, but it pays quite well, and so it's a good extra revenue, and but the membership program, the crowdfunding is the most important part of it, and by now we reached the point where we could cover, last year we could cover more than 70% of our expenses from that source, which is great. And these are helping each other. If you go to a big donor, an international foundation, and you ask for money, they are more willing to give you money if they can see that you are on a sustainable path and you have other sources as well.
It's really interesting when you're talking about, the Panama Papers, and how I think there's a sort of sexiness at that type of like big international scale, but where there's actual impact in people's lives, it's locally, and we imagine local journalism to be about sort of, the story about the cat in the tree, whereas actually, at the Bureau Local, at least we take this approach that what happens, in local communities, you can ladder that up and find out sort of what is systemically going on, and then you make a case, and I think there's a real opportunity there to connect from the ground, local, then national, then international. And I think for far too long, maybe because of the dominance of, 24-hour news cycles and that type of thing, we're very interested in sort of global trends, but there is not enough scrutiny. And I think if we talk about journalism being important for democracy, that is where it's really important, right? It's at the local level in people's lives. Majdoleen, what one tip do you guys give at the Global Investigative Journalism Network, because you support investigative teams for sustainability? So if you were to give the golden rule for how you get to sustainability, what do you say?
I think we always advise them just to first, I want just to talk about how really young people are just very into becoming investigative reporters. We started in IGN Arabic with 0 audiences on social media. Now, after 2 years, we have 12,000 followers. Most of them are interested in being investigative reporters. Every day we received, tons of requests, please, I want to be an investigative reporter. What should I do? Our work, we link them with, news organizations. We sometimes, if we find someone who really have the skill, they're the proper skills, I link them with just international media organizations. So everybody wants to do this kind of work, and some requests, they want to do local investigative journalism because they feel that they need to serve their communities. For the media outlets, who just starting, navigate their work and, building their business models. In my region, first, we just try to give them money. They need money, actually. They know how to do. Actually, they know their path. I think, you agree with me. They know how to do their work, but they need fund. They need fund to hire business manager. They need money to find a community manager. And also the other thing, and I advise them to find plan B. Because maybe you have money, you have everything, but you work under repressive regime. He will gonna kill you and attack you. So you find something alternative. What if I've been, shut down? What should I do? Where should I go? So we should seek for an alternative. Yeah.
Let's go back to the floor. Any more questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Thank you. So one question that often troubles me is what makes local journalism that matters to the whole country or even to the world? I work as a correspondent for eastern part of Germany, and oftentimes when my colleagues turn down a pitch, they don't say, that doesn't add up, or we've heard that before, but they say, well, that story might be crucial for the eastern part of Germany, but it's not to us. Right. So I wondered whether or not you have asked yourself that before. What is your prerequisite? What is your standard to a local story?
Great question. And perhaps we'll ask our Megan Lucero, who is the head of the Bureau Local team, is here. So maybe we'll get the view from the floor, but I'll also put you on the spot. What's the key to this at The Guardian? We don't have to come to her straight away. When we are getting to the answers, she can give us her 2 pence. Any more views from the audience? No. Okay, well, maybe we can ask you then, Megan. What would you say when your reporters are coming to you with a local story? We talk about the importance of it being able to ladder up to national impact. So what is the criteria that you're looking for? Panelists, please also think about your answer.
It's an excellent question, and I think the great thing about the Bureau Local is that we're trying to build something new. So by our very nature, we are questioning every approach that we've thought about journalism before, which is why you hear Eliza and Rachel speaking so eloquently on sort of community organizing. So both of that also questions what kind of stories are we telling, and how do we choose those. So she obviously spoke about sort of homelessness as being this topic that we took on. And while homelessness might have been reported previously in kind of, like I said, local papers, this person died here, this person died there, it was never going to bring a national relevance until there was a man who died on the steps of Parliament, and everyone talked about it for a couple days and it went away again. But the unique approach of the Bureau Local was to say, how do we believe that we take on stories that have to have both a local relevance but are also systemic, right? And our way of looking at that was to look at the bigger picture of that person dying, to come to the crux of the problem of how did that person die on our streets in modern Britain. And when you start to do that, we start to piece it out and finding out that no one was recording these deaths, and we set out to build the first ever database and to tell the stories of people across the country. So to choose that, we kind of did go against the grain of traditional media, but again, we have this strategic focus of always trying to get to the crux of a problem, to look at something that both affects people's lives but is also happening on a systemic level. And uniquely about the Bureau Local, what we choose to take on as well is something that can not only be done by a community of people, but can be uniquely done by a community of people. So we have this network around the country, so we try to take on stories that only the power of people could really solve, is what we're trying to do as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth acknowledging and being transparent about the fact that, you know, the journalists, editors apply certain criteria, right? Not every story that matters in the local community will reverberate even regionally, let alone locally and internationally. And I think if you're trying to adopt a more sort of community-centered model, it's being very transparent about what your criteria is, rather than implying that you're interested in hearing from everybody, but applying some sort of opaque system to decide whether it's this story or that story. So we are at the process in the moment trying to think about, should we have some sort of public statement or manifesto about what it is that the change we want to see in the world and how we want to do that with other people, using data, seeing local stories ladder up. And so then maybe, hopefully, we will start getting less, you know, hi, my grandmother's engagement ring is missing, can you look for it for us? You know, like, because we have been transparent about what it is that we're here to do and what we want to hear about. And then maybe also seeing ourselves as, because if you're visible and are good at this work, you become a bit of a lightning rod for people's ideas, then doing the sort of community service of signposting people in other directions where they can get what they need. I think that's often been the challenge, is that journalists don't seem to be community players. We kind of exist outside of communities. We don't behave like citizens ourselves. And the good citizenship thing to do is, if someone asks you for directions and you don't know, you say you don't know, you're going another way or whatever it is. You don't just kind of walk off and say, you know. So imagine yourselves as part of a community like that. To that question, what would you guys say as your response?
I don't want to get you in trouble, but maybe you should tell your editors that, I mean, maybe you should remind them to the Trump's election and the failure of almost the entire American news media, how they missed that story. Maybe one of the reasons because they didn't listen to the local people, didn't listen to those who were on the ground. And you know, some of the big failures are happening because of this, that I mean, some editors are great. I mean, I've worked with great editors, but you know, some of them are sitting far away from the where the things are happening. And maybe I don't know if she's still here, but we had a question about the what you do with all these crazy people who come to you with crazy ideas about conspiracy theories. Because to some extent, I think that this is connected to that. I think. Certainly, I learned over the years that sometimes you need to listen to the crazy people, and because sometimes the important stories are coming from them. I mean, I'm sure that many of you watched Spotlight, and you may remember how when they brought in one of the victims, and he didn't look a really trustworthy guy. He was shouting and he was aggressive, but in the end, it turned out that he was right, and it was the journalists who just overlooked this whole huge story. So, of course, yes, I mean, it sounds better than it is in reality. I know I have to, because yes, when you have to spend time with people whose ideas are actually crazy, but you never know, when you are going to meet the next big story.
Yeah, totally. Either of you want to add anything before I ask you a final wrap-up?
Yeah, I think for you, I just I witnessed the same thing because editors, they like genuinely big stories, especially news media outlets. So I think you should focus on the impact, because from my experience, local investigative journalism can easily get impact and change people's life more than that big stories. Now Arab media journalists are just very into illicit money and tracking wolf people. But I know it's important to know about them, but it's just hard to change the thing. But when it comes to local journalism, it's just hard. It's just very easy. When you publish a story, the government will try to change and to make things better. So and you can easily show them examples of that.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. So panelists, in one word, or if you can, if you were to say to the people who haven't rushed off to their next session, thank you guys, what one thing, if we're saying there is some sort of rebirth, we need that to not just survive, but we need it to thrive. So what one thing do you need from where you sit? What do you see as needed for local investigative journalism to thrive in this new cycle that it's in? Maybe we'll start with you, Rachel.
I'm going to totally break your rule and say 4 or 5 things. Sorry.
All right, then.
But I'll be quick. A few things. One is like how funders behave and fund things is super important to this, because philanthropic funding is still going to be important for a while. So funders offering funding that's unrestricted, and also kind of the reporting process is kind of thoughtful and supportive. Helping to create the idea of journalism as a public good, so that the public really start to get that message that journalists are working on their behalf and with them. Be great also with funders if they could recognise innovation and value for money of new media rather than necessarily propping up legacy media all the time. A couple of legal things. Defamation law in Scotland, for example, chills journalism across the piece. Lots of people can't publish pieces because of the threat of getting sued. And also the implementation of public information laws, so things like freedom of information. Public bodies are getting away with not returning kind of timely or accurate information, and that needs to change. Lastly, and probably most important, is the one we're kind of responsible for ourselves, is we need to keep increasing our relevance to communities across the country. We can't get complacent. We can't think that we know what people want to hear or what they're interested in. So I think that's work we just have to constantly keep building on.
Andras and Majdoleen, really quickly, please. We have a minute.
Yeah, well, I mean, mine is just really, I know it sounds like a cliche, but I truly believe in it that, as a reporter, I also believe that in legwork and to be on the ground, and I think it's true for, community building as well. It's, you cannot, do it from your armchair.
Yeah, do the proper reporting and stick with it. So everything, will go smoothly after that.
All right, thank you, everyone. I'll leave you with this saying. I'm not sure where it's from, given how we talked about there being a challenge to local journalism and a threat to it, but we're saying that it's coming back. So it's, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. Tweet that. All right. A round of applause to the panel.